We'll go ahead and get started. It's very difficult to be speaking when I have a donut in my mouth. What's that?
When we are all speaking.
And here's the thing. If ever you were wondering whether or not the whole idea of ask and you shall receive works, oh, yeah. Help yourself, Alice. And we have this notion that you should not be speaking with your mouth full of food, which makes it very difficult for me to have the next hour.
Say the last one for him.
No, you will not wait, that's for sure. No, you shouldn't be waiting.
We don't want you to be deprived.
I know. I almost feel Lenten here. Yeah, that's right.
You should start with it,
And then there you go. I like the thoughtfulness that goes into this. So we thought we'd spend the next few weeks talking, and maybe into January as well, on the theme of peace. And it's, it seems somewhat, maybe it's not silly, but it's such a ubiquitous idea around us, where we're talking about peace and then we're talking about more peace, and clearly something is off because, of course, right, all right. So at least we're on the same page here. But fear not. By the way, that phrase in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, shows up hundreds and hundreds of times, okay? There's a Hebrew phrase, it's pronounced al-tira. Literally, it means fear not, or do not be afraid, and that kind of thing. And of course, it only makes sense in the context of fear, or else it's silly, right? There has to be something about which we are afraid or we are concerned about to say, don't be afraid. If there's nothing to be afraid about, that statement becomes sort of silly, right? So the fact that we have that is sort of a preponderance of the numbers, that it should remind us there is always something about which to be afraid. And it's not a new idea. And the theme could very well be a variety of things. So I was thinking about this in the last, in preparation for this in the last week or so. And there are many thinkers that one can appeal to. And I wanted to sort of point to two, both of which you may be entirely familiar with, or if not entirely, at least familiar with. And that is, there is a person by the name of Hannah Arendt. Does that name ring a bell? Yeah. Who is, went through the Holocaust and is a Jewish philosopher, died a couple decades ago, several decades ago, and really has written extensively about a variety of things. And you want to take seriously when someone like Hannah Arendt and others speak about peace and hope, given the context out of which they're speaking and their experience, right? You take this seriously. It's very much of a sort of a, I don't want to say secular, but a secular idea. And then the second person, who might be much more familiar to most of, if not all of us, Søren Kierkegaard, okay, or Kierkegaard, the Norwegian theologian, Lutheran theologian. And what Kierkegaard says that hope is our soul's lifeline. And by the way, you can take that. Could you imagine? Here's your homework for next time. Don't get overly concerned here. It's not really homework. But what does it mean when we say that hope is your soul's lifeline? I want you to come back with a short essay on the soul. Next Sunday, the room will be empty and I'll be standing here with everyone having a reason not to be here. Okay, the soul's lifeline, and it's such a profound statement. And it, according to Kierkegaard, that idea of hope is sort of rooted in God's promise to bring about that which might seem impossible to us. And he is not the first and will not likely be the last person to make a distinction between hope and what is much more common among many people, optimism, right? I'm very optimistic that tomorrow morning the sun will rise. That there is not, maybe, right? There is not, we don't have to go home and think and hope for this, right? But this hope comes, hope has its more meaningful sort of expression in a state of what? Hopelessness. Hope comes when we feel in moments that things appear to be hopeless. And then our hope sort of gets strengthened and generated. That's the plan. Or when we think that things are impossible. I don't want to veer too much off into something that is much more absurd under the circumstances. There are two football teams playing today, among many, both of which I think I could say fairly confidently based on their record that it's hopeless. And they happen to be playing each other. And I looked at the possibility of what the chances of either making the playoffs. And it is so painful and difficult to look. And you know the symbol, right? That says less than? That symbol? And it was 1%, okay? And so mathematically, it's possible. And it depends on everyone else essentially collapsing in the next several weeks. You can go and check the record to see what the two teams are. I'll give you a hint. They're playing in Minneapolis. And one belongs here. And they are hopeless. But this is the moment when you have hope, right? In a state of hopelessness.
Someone has to win. So someone is hopeful today.
Yeah.
The two teams, one of them has to win today.
And if it were up to me, it would be a draw. But seriously.
0-0.
Yeah, absolutely. It's inside. It's inside. So Kierkegaard said, hope is really the power of God to transform the impossible to that which is possible. And it's rooted in the promises of God. I combine these two just to begin with, in part because Hannah Arendt says that hope is rooted in humanity. It's a lifeline for human beings. And she doesn't use religious language. She doesn't use theological language. She certainly does not use a sort of Christian language. But she has that background as well. And she says it's really rooted in humanity's power to begin again. To begin again. And let me just, and I say this very carefully because I don't want to insert myself into the realm of these folks. But here's the thing. What they are saying is this, that what we are experiencing, howsoever we conceive of it, is not the last word. It's not the last word. It is never the last word. At our best, it's penultimate. At our best, it's penultimate. And I know we throw around the word perfect and all of that. By the way, that animal doesn't exist for us human beings. Okay? But it's not the last word. The problem is how to move from here to there. And sometimes that journey is what makes it difficult. For Kierkegaard, that journey is led through the promises of God that says the impossible is still possible. And we see that in the Abraham narratives as well. And Aaron says, it's really up to us human beings. We have to do it. So we can't just sit around and say, well, you know what? Things are just going to happen miraculously. So we want to keep that in mind as we begin this process of talking about a time for peace, justice, and righteousness here. And what I want to, we will get into the text. What I want to point out is this. Let me see if I have this up here. I was thinking about this. I'll go back to, can you see this? You can, yeah, you can see that. I have the, and you recognize this, right? You recognize this. We see variations of this, certainly even within Good Shepherd, and we see it elsewhere as well. And you recognize it. There are two sets of symbols up here, right? And both sets are Greek, of course. Okay. One we know because we can see it on the altar cloth, as they call it, which of course is what? The Alpha and the Omega, right? And I'm emphasizing this because what we want to talk a little bit about is certainly ancient things within the Hebrew, but also keep in mind the church is emerging in what tradition? In really the Greco-Roman world. With you know, that's why the New Testament is in Greek, right? And we've inherited some of these ideas as well. The other, you recognize the other symbol? It's the Chi-Rho, right? The Chi-Rho, which we don't think as often about, but we should. What looks like a P, of course, in Greek is a rho, R-H-O, and that thing that looks like an X that a lot of people freak out about, you know, because it looks like Xmas, right? But because you and I are enlightened, we know, of course, it's not an X, it's, of course, Chi, right? The first letters for Christ. For Christ. And if you don't, you shouldn't be in a fraternity or sorority, right? So I put that up there because, of course, we have this kind of context in which things emerge. We still use the alphabet, whether it's the Chi-Rho to sort of clearly CH plus the rho, you know, the opening letters for Christ, and of course Jesus being the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. So that's sort of the context in which things emerge. What we will find, not surprisingly, and certainly not only because, as perhaps you have come to sort of know about my own interests, that justice and righteousness are foundational. These are not marginal ideas, and they are not just theoretical ideas. I was thinking about this this morning. I think it was Amy who was telling the kids, who, by the way, had taken over clearly the whole children's kind of stuff. And you'll have to forgive me while I sit there being entirely entertained by them. And she was talking about wind, right? And how it, you know, around. And of course, you know, right, both in the Hebrew and in the Greek, essentially the parallel words, ruach or pneuma, has three meanings in each case, which of course is what? Breath, wind, and spirit. Okay, it's much more obvious in the Greek because the word pneuma has given rise to our English word pneumonia. It's the same word, all right? And I was thinking about that, and my mind wandered to what at least in our educational system where I grew up was called, instead of elementary, it's called primary school. And I remember my teacher telling us about abstract nouns. Okay? And her simple explanation was that abstract nouns you cannot see or feel, or you cannot see, something along those lines. I'm trying to remember this, right? And then she said, you need to make a sentence using an abstract noun. And my sentence included the word wind, right? And she said, no. And I said, I was in primary school, and I said, but I can't see it. Right? And she said, because you're not so, and by the way, I would later on come to realize that, I was not as smart as my teacher. Okay. So this idea that, justice and righteousness is not an abstract idea. It's not an idea that we could say, well, it's simply out there, and it's really nice that Jesus and the Hebrew prophets use it all the time. Actually, it's the practical idea of how do we do this. And we will see this in the context of peace. We cannot speak about the Prince of Peace, right, as Christmas and as Advent and Christmas approaches, and then the Prince of Peace disappears into some kind of holding space until next year. It has to matter in terms of who we are and what we do. So Jesus and the prophets refer to the coming of the Messiah. And there are two words up here. And what we have to remember is that sometimes we think of these words such as the word Messiah, for example, Meshiach in Hebrew. It's not, how should I put it? It's not an uncommon word. It's a fairly common word, right? And it's not a word that is only connected with Jesus. So we have to sort of, rid ourselves of that idea. In fact, David says God's anointed because the word means anointed. That's what the word means. There's nothing sort of fancy about this. The word means anointed. One who is anointed, but you're not just anointed to run around with a crown on your head saying, look at me, I'm anointed. It's anointed like sort of like sacred, sort of like holy. These words mean that you carry that in terms of your calling, in terms of what you do. You can't simply say, I'm holy, and then put a period after that. It is always for a purpose. One is anointed for a purpose. Period. That's where you put a period. Now you can begin to ask what the purpose is. So let me give you an example of someone, just so that we sort of keep this in mind. One does not have to be Jewish. One does not have to be Christian to be anointed. One could be anointed by God regardless of who one is, who is set apart. And maybe the most important and notable example in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, of such a person is, I'm going to put you to the test, Cyrus, who was, of course, Persian, right? And who God, pardon me, and who is described as God's anointed. He is God's Meshiach. And it would be Cyrus, the Persian, who would become the instrument of what? Yes, delivering the captives out of Babylon, out of the Babylon. So, you could see where a couple of things are happening here, right? We are reminded, strangers, in case we forgot, strangers, And in case that doesn't ring a bell, outsiders. And in case that still doesn't ring a bell, who may not believe as we do, they have a role? Okay, again, let me sort of broaden this a little bit. When we looked at Jonah in the last few weeks, right, the group that came out looking best, so to speak, in that story are whom? The sailors, the mariners, the outsiders, the foreigners. They're described as such. The Ninevites. It was not Jonah. Jonah, Pastor Jan reminded me last week, Jonah went out and sat east of the city, which is where, sort of the burial ground is, where the cemetery is, waiting. Jonah, and I know this is painful for us, Jonah is us. Jonah is the insider here. Jonah is the one who is called to bring a message to save the outsiders. And his reaction is what? I'm just going to run away. Which, by the way, again, we talked about this. That's a basic premise, right? And if the premise is faulty, you know what happens. Everything else. It doesn't matter how nice it's developed. And of course, Jonah's reason for running is why?
He knows God's going to forgive him anyway.
Yeah. And also why?
He thought that he deserved to be punished, Nineveh, because they're evil.
Yeah. And why would we sort of, quote, waste God's grace on these outsiders? I mean, do they really deserve grace? I mean, and by the way, not only that, Jonah is the one who is going to determine whether or not they deserve grace. So imagine, just put it in human terms, okay, I'm willing to grant all of you, well, donuts. And Alan comes along and says, well, that group over there does not deserve donuts. And I say to, are these your donuts? And he says to me, it doesn't really matter. They just don't deserve donuts, and I'm going to take the donuts and run away. Which, by the way, Alan would do. Jonah has decided that grace cannot cannot be squandered on these foreigners. And yet, again and again and again, we have these instances within the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, where outsiders are used. And after generation after generation after generation, we see coming out of Ruth, right? You end up with King David. And not only that, which other person of some dubious character that we talked about? Rahab. You remember that? Yes. And we can see generation after generation after generation, the Messiah of whom we speak this morning will come from the stem of Jesse. And we can trace that all the way back to a certain prostitute who gave hiding, so to speak, and protection to the two men. So in case we're wondering if somehow this idea, and as you know, on a daily basis in our society, sadly, right, we have this ongoing issue of foreigners who are destroying our society. And yet, the very folks who are saying that are the ones who say we embrace the tenets of Christianity. And so you have a disconnect of course, and in Greek, Christos. So, I also this time thought it would be interesting to compare what the King James says and what the New Revised Version of the Bible says in terms of translation. So we'll do a little bit of reading. And I will tell you, there are times, just because of the sound and the history of some of these texts, and we saw that a little bit, I think I shared this with you, in the book of Ruth, when Ruth decided that she was going to follow Naomi. And we have this magnificent text that has become the Song of Ruth that begins how? Entreat me not to leave you, right? And, I can't get that out of my head. That's the word I want, even though we don't use it anymore, frankly. It's too bad. It's a beautiful word. And its change has become current. But some things, some things have to remain black and white for our generation, if you will. Entreat me not. And then we get to the King James. For unto us a child is born. Unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder. And I'm just asking, how do we parse this? What does this mean? Is this just a beautiful sort of opening line for unto us? What does it mean to have the government upon his shoulder? And so we're not sort of dissecting here, but we, as we sometimes do, we're asking questions. What does this mean? And his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor with a double L. The Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. So let me pause there, and we look at a New Revised Standard Version. For a child has been born to us. Yes, it's the same thing. It doesn't have the kind of poetic beauty, right? It's true. But it means the same thing. A son is given to us. Authority rests upon his shoulders. It's the parallel, right? Which is more inclusive, government or authority? By the way, this is not, as they say in Scandinavian context, this is not a smorgasbord. Okay. And even that sounds better than buffet, doesn't it? I mean, this is not a smorgasbord. By the way, no one says it that way anyway. So you don't get to really choose, so to speak. But a government will be, and sometimes maybe that old translation in our context is even more telling right now, where the idea that the one who is to come, it is on that one's Messiah, the shoulders of the Messiah, that the government will be upon.
The way we would define government is not the way it's meant here, is it? I mean, when we say government, we think of our elected government, but this government is just talking about showing people how to live, telling people how to live, so governing people as opposed to what we would think of as elected officials.
Okay. How do we know that?
They did have elected officials back then.
Mostly appointed, for sure. No, but what we're doing here actually is entering into what we do. The fancy word for all of this is really hermeneutics. What we're doing here is a science of interpretation, right? Because sometimes folks say, well, this is the way it was in those days. And immediately we might have to pause and say,
It's not black and white.
well, it's not black and white. And how do we know with certainty, right? But then we get the translators to say all authority. right? Is this the authority of a family, of an institution, of a country, of a community, right? And you're right, it doesn't quite measure up to the structure that we have, but we're also looking at the idea of on the shoulders of the one who is to come will rest.
May I just add, it's only my interpretation, but when I look at it as a comparison, the government is responsible for justice. And therefore, that King James Version, I think, gives us a kind of an idea there. When I think of authority, I think of the prosecutor, which is different from justice.
Now, the government is, let's say the government is in charge of justice. Now, here is the thing, right? What I would say. It cannot just stop there, okay? And I'll use an example that might seem a little strange, so hang in here with me. In Japanese religious tradition, there is something that is called filial piety. Okay, filial piety. Now, it should not be just filial because it's really for the children, right? But as you know, we don't care about the females. But filial piety. Why is filial piety important? It is believed that how one functions in the context of a family, with respect, with care, with regard, with understanding, with love, all of the biggies, right? One should take those and do what? Take them into how one lives in society. Okay? In other words, I can't say filial piety is important to me, but it's only within the four walls of my home. So we can't say that the government, that is the one who makes the rules, the laws, the one, frankly, who is fundamentally supposed to oversee the goodness of society, must also now be sort of moved in the manner in which we live. It has to be that way. It can't be, well, that's the government responsibility and they have to care for us, but I don't really have to care for anyone because that's their, no, it doesn't work that way. We must carry on. By the way, to be honest, I tell faculty this often, that at the end of the day, right, it is not just the discipline that you teach, and it is most certainly not only your credentials. The reason here is that you're credentialed to be here, but that's not what will make you a great teacher. And I guarantee you, in time to come when your students write to you, they will not say, I was so touched by your master's or your PhD. They don't care. But it will be, right, in those moments, occasionally throwaway moments, but moments nonetheless that have made a mark and that they will never forget. And in time, there will be something that will emerge that will bring back that memory, because we don't forget, we simply have challenges recalling, right? And you will recall something, and you will write, and you will say, I remember. I remember. And there is nothing that brings a life back than the importance of memory. We better remember and not just hear these words as words that have an ancient reminiscence, but really not to us. The Prince of Peace has to mean something. The government upon his shoulders has to mean something for us. And I think we're living in those times. What is also interesting is that in the King James Version, the Messiah is described as wonderful, comma. And in the New Revised, right, there is no comma, right? And let me tell you, you know full well, right, you know that punctuation matters, right? You know, you've seen the title of the book, right? 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 He shoots and leaves, right? And leaves. And grammar, remember the one with grammar, right? If you don't have a comma there, you'll end up eating grammar, right? Okay. We need punctuation. And here, a choice is made. Is the Messiah a wonderful counselor or wonderful, comma, counselor? And keep in mind, we didn't have any punctuation, right? It was just one flow. And folks like us, you and I, have determined, you know what, we need a comma here. And then folks who came after us decided, we don't need a comma there.
We should just ask Handel.
We could have, right?
Handel's answered the question.
Handel puts a comma in it.
He does.
When we sing.
He certainly does.
And you know what I will say to Handel, who cares? So here's the thing, right? We're the ones who are making this determination, aren't we? Right?
I have a question.
So, yes.
I'm sorry. I've read that this is referring to, in the context, to Cyrus the Great. Is that accurate?
It could be, because of course, in a way, it precedes, right? But again, these are things that we have inherited and have determined that in this case, Messiah, as the Prince of Peace, is not just a moment, right? Now, I don't want to sort of suggest that Cyrus's role was only a moment to be discarded. It isn't. But this is a larger picture here. And by the way, scholars have said, well, you know, this is, I mean, keep in mind that it is 537, 538 before the Babylonian exile ends. Okay? This text is it's in the 8th century. So we're looking centuries before that, right? And so one could begin, because now you're looking back at what happened, clearly, right? But this is a larger idea. So punctuation matters. Let me give you one other example. And I've written about this. You remember what I consider, you don't have to agree with me in this regard, but I consider one of the most difficult and painful texts. And I say that, and you will understand, also as a parent, but just as another human being, is the idea of Abraham being told, take your son, your only son, up this mountain. I'll show you where. And I want you to do what? Sacrifice him. Which is, by the way, don't misunderstand sacrifice to mean something theoretical. I want you to do, sacrifice means that you're going to do what? Kill this son. And by the way, you are not using a butter knife here. The text is something like a cleaver. And there, and Isaac says to his father, where's the lamb to sacrifice? And he says to Isaac, God will provide. Okay? Should you have a comma after provide? Is it God will provide, comma, my son? Okay? Alan prefers the comma. So, by the way, it's settled. I'm going to write to all of my scholarly friends and says, Alan Carson says he needs a comma. But of course, actually the comma is the most, pretty much across the board, right? But the question, it does raise the question, doesn't it? God will provide, comma, okay? And of course, provide means what? Literally. Provideo, one who sees ahead, really. That's what provide means, literally, okay? So we know what, God knows what lies ahead, except we don't really know what lies ahead.
I just have to ask, in that particular example, is there no grammatical case ending on the word my son to signify that it's the accusative or the ablative or the genitive or anything to give you a sense that vocative, like anything to say, oh no, I really did mean not that you are the sacrifice, but that I'm talking to you, my son.
And I love this question because the answer is no.
Of course.
Okay? I mean, I could go on and let me explain what I mean about no. Okay? But actually, it's there. Seriously, my son. That word could be my son in any other context, and it would translate my son.
Without any grammatical
No.
anything to let you know?
To let you know, hint, hint, read the footnotes, no.
Nothing.
Nothing.
But does that exist in Hebrew?
Hmm?
Does that exist in Hebrew? The ability to say?
Sure, the context will dictate. Yeah,
But
how
in
things.
this case, it's
No,
not clear
no,
at all.
no,
It's just-
no. And it just keeps going.
Yeah.
It just, it just keeps going this way, right? Of the increase of his government and peace shall be, I mean, here is what we also, here's what we also want to emphasize. Of the increase of his government and peace, there shall be no end upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom, to order it and to establish with judgment and with justice, and henceforth even forever. Okay. By the way, we could take this text and wait for a lifetime to understand how this will ever be fulfilled in our time. And, you know, it's fine to say Christ is coming again soon. And you know, we're sitting here and you know you want to ask, when? And could you help me define soon? Okay, because we are that kind of a people, right? That's not good enough. You know, I'll get back to you soon. Don't call me out. By the way, you might as well move on, right? And of course, that's the language that was used in ancient times. Jesus says to the disciples what? Essentially, I'll see you in a while.
2,000 years.
At a minimum. Okay? And counting. So, here's what it says. Peace will come and there'll be no end. Has that happened? No. And I'm saying to us, and we joke about this, but in a group such as ours and others, right? And we might use the language of enlightened, but at the end of the day, you hear folks saying, well, you know, we don't need the Old Testament anymore because the Old Testament is law, and the New Testament has fulfilled that. Right? I do not know what you're reading, or more accurately, drinking, okay, to arrive at that conclusion, because it is fundamentally untrue. But you know, if you say it often enough and loud enough, and in so many instances obnoxious enough, right, folks will begin to believe it. Except it's not there, right? This is an ongoing, and that's why we begin our session with the word hope. Hope. That in fact it is the belief in something that will be fulfilled, and it might not be in our lifetime. But we can't sit and wait and say, well, you know, it doesn't really matter. It's also what we do. So, go back here, it says, establish it with judgment and with justice. Look at the New Revised Standard Version. He will establish it and uphold it with what? Justice and righteousness. And this is why maybe the second translation is important. Because when you hear the word judgment, let's be honest. Is it a positive, neutral, or negative overtone? It's almost always negative. Almost always negative. That there is a judgment, right? But the word that is used here actually means righteousness. It's tzedakah. It's the word that we have talked about previously. And so the one who is going to come, here are the three words. The one who is going to come will come to establish peace. But that peace can only be born out of what? Justice. And let me put this as bluntly as I know how. One cannot expect peace unless there is justice and righteousness. You can't. And justice and righteousness is not some kind of abstract idea. It has economic overtones. It has social overtones. It has cultural overtones. It has gender overtones. And it goes on. So to say that justice and righteousness are sort of foundational for peace has to be reckoned with. What does that mean? And what does that mean in our time? So that we don't reduce what we're reading as some kind of ancient, sort of out of touch, interesting reminiscent, but really has nothing to do with us. No. What does this mean for our time? Let me focus for just a second before we run out of time here. What does it mean in our time for everyone to have economic justice? Why we throw around these words, right? What does that mean?
Wishful thinking. Wishful thinking.
Wishful thinking. You're not old enough to be cynical, so. And no one is. Here's the thing. All right, back up. The word economics or economy, rooted in Greek, means what?
House numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, tell me your name. I forgot your name. David. Okay, house numbers or household, oikos, right? Oikos. By the way, the word ecumenical is the same root. Okay, it's the same root as economics or economy. Oikos means house. Okay, economics is the well-being of the household. That's what economics is. We cannot have justice, we cannot have economic justice unless the whole household has justice. That's what the word means. By the way, I know particularly the women in this room in a different generation going through school did what? Something called home economics, which of course is redundant, right? Because the word economics means house or home economics. It's kind of like talking about the Potomac River. The word Potomac means what? River, okay? Or the Sahara Desert, because Sahara means desert, okay, yeah, all right. But that's for emphasis. So to talk about economic justice is to talk not only about one section of the household. It has to be the whole household. If we believe in the Prince of Peace, then it is incumbent that we ensure that the foundation is just for everyone, or there cannot be peace. I don't know how else to put it. Okay? And we don't have to look, again, to go to someone like Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau, 170 years ago, writing about, in this profound essay called On Civil Disobedience. And he said, we Americans have a habit when we're facing difficulties, right? We have a habit of pointing to what he calls the far-off foe. the far off foe, the ones who are out there. They're the ones. Because it's very difficult to do what? Look at ourselves. And these are texts that say, look at us. We have to look at ourselves in terms of what we do. And so he will establish and uphold justice with righteousness from this time onward and forevermore. But this time onward and forevermore is not here as yet. And we heard in chapter 11 this morning, the Old Testament text. Okay. I want to say one quick thing here. If you flip over in Isaiah chapter 26, 2 verses. Again, as a reminder. And we can never read these texts. Let me go back. We can never read these texts sort of enough, in my view. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, back to Isaiah 11. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the kid, the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them, and the cow and the bear shall feed. Their young ones shall lie down together, the lion shall eat straw like an ox, and the suckling child shall play on the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the cockroach's. By the way, is that a part of your vocabulary, that word? Adder. Is the snake, the adder. They shall not hurt or destroy in all of my holy mountain, for the Lord shall be full of the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the earth. What does it mean to have the knowledge? And it is more than, this is not about information. It's about understanding. And the word fundamentally has to do with what? It's a relational word. By the way, you cannot just say, I know our kids say this, but you cannot just say, I know, and I'll put a period after it. It's a relational word. And it's a word that maybe I would even translate as intimacy. To know the Lord is to have an intimate relationship. And that's why sometimes it has a sexual overtone as well. Okay, even though it is only used like 2% of the time. That's sort of almost taken over. But it has to do with that closeness. So to know the Lord is to have an intimate relationship with the Lord. So, and then we get to 26. And it says, thou wilt keep him in perfect peace whose mind is stayed on thee, because he trusteth. And you see the King James, the New Revised says, those of steadfast mind you keep in peace because they trust in you. Trust in the Lord forever, for in the Lord God you have an everlasting rock. It's a very fascinating here. Here, the King James Version translates this phrase as what? Perfect peace. So I'm going to ask you quickly, define perfect peace for me.
How can you
Here's the thing, we can't, and anyone who wants to sell you a bill of goods defining that, hang on to your wallet and walk away. Because for that to make sense, you have to have a sense of perfect, which we don't. But here is the thing that is important. The word shalom is used twice here. And what we have that is translated perfect peace is meant to be peace with such an intense emphasis. And I'm going to leave you with a bit of a cliffhanger here, because it says, the Lord Jehovah, which, by the way, that's a hybrid word. That word doesn't exist in the Bible, just for the record. That's a made-up word, which we'll explain next time. And it says everlasting strength. The New Revised Standard Version says everlasting rock, neither of which is in the Hebrew. And so I know you're thinking, well, I'm so excited to find out what's in the Hebrew. Next time. Okay, I will tell you exactly what's in the Hebrew. And it will not be that clear. All right, thanks everyone. Huh?
Shalom, shalom.
Shalom, shalom.
Is that what it says? Not perfect peace, but shalom, shalom?
Yeah.